With Donald Trump lashing out, insisting that warnings of a potential recession are part of some sort of conspiracy to hurt him personally. Now, we know Trump struggles to tell the truth. This story shows how he may assume others are automatically taking the same tack. He treats everything as a kind of a game or a con rather than acknowledging some sort of objective reality. And that helps understand these headlines. Trump now agitated about anything going on when he discusses the economy and darkly suggesting warnings about a possible recession stem from critics trying to take away what he sees as his calling card for re-election, according to the New York Times reporting. So who are these critics? It's a conspiracy theory, so remember, it doesn't have to make a lot of sense. Donald Trump blaming people he hired, like his own hand-picked Fed chair, intentionally acting against him, and U.S. allies. A weird argument, since many have their fortunes pinned to our economy. And then there's the idea that the media is trying to create a recession. All of this is the backdrop for these comments.
And are you doing any planning, or are you going to be directing your administration to plan for the possibility of a recession?
I don't see a recession.
But a lot of economists say that you should be preparing for a recession, that no president is immune from a recession, and that it's malpractice for the government not to be doing something.
Yeah, Phil, honestly, I'm prepared for everything. I don't think we're having a recession. We're doing tremendously well. Most economists actually say, Phil, that we're not going to have a recession.
No recession. No planning for a recession. Don't even talk about it. You know, looking at this today, there are some things in life that are more likely to happen if you do talk and think about them too much. Like going to a kitchen, going to maybe your kitchen to get a snack right now. I bet if you keep thinking about it and imagining it or talking about it, you might find yourself getting up, letting the newscast play in the background, and grabbing that snack that you've been thinking about. But a macroeconomic recession is not like getting a snack. No single person increases its likelihood by talking about it, not even the president. So avoiding talking about it in the hopes that it will go away and then avoiding any planning about it, that's ineffective and pretty short-sighted for the U.S. government. As for Trump's claim that you just heard there, that economists don't expect a recession, well, 1 out of 4 don't. The other 74% of economists are now expecting a recession by the end of 2021 in a new survey out today. Trump also in denial about other data, this time a Fox News poll that showed him trailing his challengers.
Fox has changed, and my worst polls have always been from Fox. There's something going on at Fox, I'll tell you right now, and I'm not happy with it.
I'm asking about the Fox poll that they had you under 1 or against your main.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it.
Okay, he doesn't believe it. You know, the people who know Donald Trump best describe him as a con man. That includes everyone ranging from the currently incarcerated former lawyer, Michael Cohen, to his former reality show colleague, which he brought famously to the White House, Omarosa, to his former communications director, Anthony Scaramucci, now calling for Trump's defeat. I have more on that shortly. So Donald Trump's accustomed to denying reality, denying his own teammates. And because he's so used to making everything up, what we're seeing here when you take it together is he may not even understand that there are other people, including in his own government, who actually work off the evidence. And just because something looks bad for him doesn't mean it's a fake. Just because something looks good for him doesn't mean it's true. Take that allegedly large union crowd at Trump's speech last week in Pennsylvania. It looked good, it was touted, it got attention. But today, new reports showing those workers were actually effectively paid to be there. They had to go to the speech or they would have lost part of their paycheck, which is actually an echo of the way Trump built his very first crowd at Trump Tower for the campaign, paying actors to cheer and impersonate supporters. Now, let's be clear. Paying actors at that first rally was not a long-term plan. It was a classic fake it till you make it. And Trump did make it for a while. There were big crowds that obviously were not paid. There was an electoral college victory, even though he drew less votes than Clinton. But now as Trump denies this factual bad news and leans into faking good news, the question is whether time is running out on this strategy and how a recession could upend what looks to be his precarious political footing. I'm joined tonight by Danielle Moody Mills, host of the SiriusXM radio show Woke AF, Maria Hinojosa, anchor and executive producer of NPR's Latino USA, and Rick Stengel, former diplomat in the Obama administration and managing editor of Time magazine. Nice to have you all here in New York together on a summer night.
It's great to be here.
Wonderful.
It is a party. What do you think of the way Donald Trump is coping?
He's coping like the compulsive liar that he is, which is deny, 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 distort, distort, distort. That's what he does. So he sets it up so that if something does go wrong with the economy, if we do go into a recession, he's going to have blamed China. He will have blamed his hand-picked Federal Reserve chairman. It will be everyone else's fault but Donald Trump's. And this is what he did with the election in 2016. He told us that the election was going to be rigged if he didn't win. He said that there were millions of people who were voting that were not citizens of the United States. So he was literally setting up the stage so that if in fact he failed, that it was going to be about everything else other than the fact that Donald Trump is actually a failure. You
mentioned that whole attempt to not only undermine the economic reality, but the actual voting. He was back at that. Take a look.
You have a lot of voter fraud. Many, many people voted that shouldn't have been voted. Some people voted many times. What I'm saying is we need voter identification. We need voter ID.
Now, quick fact check, because we don't play that stuff without context. We'll show you here the actual person who runs the Federal Election Committee chair says absolutely no evidence whatsoever. And we know that. So what does it mean to see this in this period where Donald Trump is sort of, as far as he's concerned, he's post-Mueller, he's unbridled in a certain way, and what we're seeing in these sort of months is anti-reality or anti-minority in the way he's been organizing politically.
And also the idea that we set up a complete and total gaslight, right? One of the shooters, his manifesto in El Paso said invasion, invasion, invasion over and over again. So Donald Trump feeds this narrative, and he's telling people they're coming to vote illegally. So when we see lines wrapped around polling stations of black and brown people, oh, they must be up to something nefarious, right? And so it's this idea that as long as he can set the stage like he did at Shell, the picture looks good. We then are left on the defense to tell the American people that the picture is a lie, but the picture was already snapped.
So what's really crazy, because I want to talk a little bit about the union thing, as well as, as this notion that people like me, who are not born in this country, and who may be not here with papers or with a green card, would be rushing to go vote. You know, right now, if you talk to any immigrant right now, what they're not thinking about is outwardly doing anything that could be perceived to be in any way illegal. So there's just this notion. I mean, again, he has painted us now as immigrants who are coming here, crossing illegally, that we're taking over, and that now we're going to take over the polls and the polling booths. So now we're going to be shot because we're attempting to vote, and they're going to see us as invaders. And the other thing is that's really crazy, Ari, talking about the union workers who were paid to show up. You know, this was like when I was growing up and we would go to Mexico, this is what we heard about what was happening during the PRI, which was in power for 70-something years in Mexico. It was like an autocratic, corrupt regime. And we would hear, no, what they do is that they pay all the people to come out. Like, I grew up hearing this and just thinking like, well, that would never happen in the United States. And at this point, what we know now is that those workers basically had to show up in order to get paid, to make their bills, whether or not they liked Trump or not. What is happening to our country that somehow this is like, and it's okay, you know, it's okay.
Yeah, well, you say that and you say, well, you know, can it happen here? Which is an old echo on a number of levels when you think about what we deal with, large and small. I want to read from this reporting because this is not normal. This should not become a part of our civic and political life. The headline, Shell workers would have lost pay if they missed the Trump speech at this plant. Several workers said people didn't show up because they didn't like Trump. One worker said they didn't want to come, but thought it would look bad to miss this day of work and full pay. And then get this. Dozens of workers tried to leave early before Trump had finished. As 3 p.m. approached, they were told Secret Service wouldn't let them out of the warehouse until Trump had left the property.
Yikes. Yikes. I mean, I don't know, because this is, to me, the bigger question is the game that's being played with our democracy.
Yeah, and
the game that's being played with our democracy, and just kind of like the reporting on it, the normalization of it, which we're constantly saying, guys, this is not going to lead us anyplace positive on election night. Just not going to lead us to someplace positive.
Well, it's a little like the old Soviet Union, right, where you had to show up when the leader of the Soviet Union was there, or you wouldn't have been paid. And the thing that, the theme of everything, I'm trying to unite everything that we've been discussing, Ari. The theme is data. And the data that is ignored by President Trump. When we talk about the possibility of a recession, what is a recession? A recession is 2 consecutive quarters of contracting economy. We just saw that in Germany, which has been a much healthier economy. We saw factory starts are at a 3-year low. Consumer spending and purchasing power is at a 3-year low. Economists don't just put a finger in the wind and decide maybe it's going to be a recession, maybe it's not. They're looking at data. Data that Donald Trump ignores. And you know what Donald Trump's philosophy is with data? The Chico Marx philosophy, which is, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? What he does.
Yeah.
We just brought up the Marx Brothers.
I know. I think Harry
Strong.
But because what he does, like what autocrats do, is they say, ignore the data, ignore empirical reality, pay attention to me. Don't pay attention to that. And that's what he's doing over and over.
What is Fox News going to do now? I mean, he's taking on Fox News, so is Fox News, the shoe's going to be reversed right now. He's starting to criticize Fox News. So are they going to do like a primetime special that's like, the American economy growing and growing, just because
that's exactly what all of the anchors there have been doing. They're telling the American people that it is, I mean, I try not to, but they tell the American public that everything is okay, the economy is strong, it's the media who is at fault, it's the liberal media that is trying to make the economy weak so that Donald Trump doesn't win re-election, as if a weak economy would be good for the American public. No, but it's this idea that they just continue to reverberate these conspiracy theories, and it's like they are in this closed loop.
And so to pick up on Richard's point that connects with what you're saying, there's on the one hand data and how much can you fight the numbers and the facts and the evidence. And then there are these bubble events. I mean, George Soros, who knows his way around the markets, has talked about the fact that bubbles do exist, and a very powerful amplified con man can contribute to a bubble, just like the ratings agencies can. But they pop when there are reality-inducing events. And that, I think, is why the recession, beyond the political reasons, also scares Trump, because you can't be a con man if you don't know how to trick people. And it's much harder to trick people about, say, the temperature in this room, right, than it is about something going on over there, because there are limits to that. And so it is interesting when you see his obsession with bringing on people who are effectively, and I don't mean to reduce them to only this, but who at least as a minimum are really good at television. So Larry Kudlow, who we're about to hear from, who is involved in the economics, who's been on this show, who I think knows economics and is good on television, but also has a track record, both in and out of government, of boostering the economy regardless of the data and the recession, which worked for him. And he was called out on this a little bit here. He currently works for Trump. Take a look.
Well, I tell you what, I sure don't see a recession. We're doing pretty darn well, in my judgment. Let's not be afraid of optimism. Let's not be afraid of optimism.
But, you actually said that in 2007, right before the second worst downturn in American history. This is what you wrote. There's no recession coming. This is in December of 2007. The pessimistas were wrong.
Rick, before I let you answer, I have to ask you, were the pessimistas wrong? No. There was a big recession, so he's doing it again. It doesn't mean it's coming this time, but Trump clearly says, who do I want running the economy or having this economic role? At least someone who can go on TV and smooth this all out.
We have nothing to fear but fear itself. That's what Mr. Kudlow is saying. Now, of course, consumer confidence is a part of the economy, and there's nothing wrong with boosting the economy to try to instill more consumer confidence. But let's pull back for a second, Ari. We're in there's been a 10-year economic expansion. 8 years of that were under President Obama. Can that continue forever? I guess it could. But all of the expansions always come to an end. The music begins to stop. So that's what we see happening now. Nobody is rooting for it. But if you look at all the data that I was talking about, you look China is slowing down, Germany is slowing down, the UK is slowing down. This is a global phenomenon. It's not just a U.S. phenomenon. And it's really benefited people for a long time.
And I'm over on time, so I'll just close with a one-word answer when it comes to the economy and the future of American democracy. So you get one word each. Are you a pessimista or an optimista?
Optimista.
About the economy?
You can do both.
You know what? I'm the immigrant. So if the economy turns down bad, that means that he's going to come after people like me in order for his reelection. So this is a very
So
difficult.
you are pessimista.
But I try to be an optimista every day. Every day.
I think you pronounce it better than me and Larry Kudlow. I like the way you say it.
I'm a pessimista. It doesn't look good. 74% of economists are saying it so.
So there you go. And Larry is invited back on the beat if he wants to join us. We can hash it all out. Danielle, Maria, and Rick, thanks to each of you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.